All right, I think to really make good use of our time, I will slowly get us started now. So welcome everyone who's here. I assume a few more will continue to join. It's a great pleasure to be all of us here together, and I'm very much looking forward to the time we'll spend together today. It's a pleasure for me to first introduce a little bit the idea here, the Julia Watkin Memorial Kierkegaard Lecture. So I'll start by telling you a little bit about Julia. As many of you know, most of you know, Julia was a leading scholar in the field of Kierkegaard studies. Beginning in the 70s and 80s, she could be found at the center of the Kierkegaard world, living in Kierkegaard's hometown. Julia taught at the People's University in Copenhagen, and she hosted scholars who came to Denmark from all around the globe. She founded the important International Kierkegaard newsletter, and she did invaluable work translating Kierkegaard together with Aurd and Hedna Hong. Julia Watkin was eventually a senior lecturer at the University of Tasmania until her death at the age of 62 on January 24th, 2005, shortly after this lecture series began in her honor. She had strong ties with and was a great benefactor to the Kierkegaard Library. So it is a great honor for us to continue her legacy with this biannual lecture series, which we've recently moved online so that so many people can join. Before introducing our guest, I will set the scene briefly for what we can plan on doing together today. Our speaker will hold the floor for about 30 minutes, which should leave plenty of time afterwards for discussion. So please make note throughout his talk of any questions that you're having, because we can really spend a good amount of time in discussion together afterwards. And then I will make sure that we end promptly on the half an hour. That's 12:30 in my corner of the world. But at different times for the rest of you, an hour from now about, as we know that many of you have to continue on to your teaching or your evenings or whatever you need to do next. So let me please introduce our speaker. Jon Stewart is a philosopher, a historian of philosophy, and a specialist in Kierkegaard and Hegel, among others. He spent 20 years at the Søren Kierkegaard Research Center in Copenhagen, followed by a stay at Harvard University. Today, he's a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy at the Slovak Academy of Sciences. Jon has written countless books, chapters, and articles on Kierkegaard and Kierkegaard's wider Danish Golden Age context. He is editor on numerous resources in Kierkegaard studies, as well as on the journal Philosophia. Jon's work has been impactful and often reorientating. It is a great honor and a pleasure to welcome Jon to speak with us today. The exciting title of his talk is The Enigma of Adler's Revelation. Jon, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. Pleasure to see everybody again. Hi. Thanks so much for coming here. Thanks so much for your interest. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. I have a PowerPoint presentation. There we go. And so, yeah, let me just start by saying thank you for this opportunity. It's really an honor to be able to present the Julia Watkin Memorial Lecture. It's a good occasion to reflect on Julia's work as a pioneer in Kierkegaard studies, and also on her life and her person. Is always such a wonderful woman who was always super kind and super helpful to everybody she knew. Really very fond memories of her back in Copenhagen many years ago. And it's great to have the occasion to remember her once again. And so thanks so much to Anna and Donna, Brian, Jill, everybody for at the library for the invitation. It's really a pleasure. Let me go ahead and start by saying something about the background of this lecture that I want to give today. Some of you presumably know I've spent the last few years reworking and rewriting my book, A History of Hegelianism in Golden Age Denmark. And I have just this year published a second revised edition of the first Tome 1 and Tome 2. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to keep my long promise to write one day a Tome 3. And indeed, I have done that now, I'm happy to say, and it will appear in the first few months of next year. In fact, just today, I got the first typeset proofs. I took that as an auspicious omen. And so when I started to work on that, it seemed to me absurd to let the first two volumes simply remain in the form that they were in 2007 when they were first published, because everything has changed in the field since, and so much more has been done. So I decided I have to update those in addition to publishing the third volume. And so when I was working on this long promised third volume, it struck me that there were some points of continuity that gave me some new perspectives that I hadn't really seen before. Just making an attempt to go through systematically all of these publications during that period. So I'm talking about the period that the third tome treats, 1842 to 1855. And this gave me some insights that I wanted to share with you today, and particularly on the question of the person of Adler, right? We all know Kierkegaard's famous book, the book on Adler, where he criticizes Adler for his purported revelation, and where Kierkegaard takes this as a sign of religious confusion. And for the modern commentators, people have struggled to make any sense of this. I mean, what's the story with this guy Adler? Goes around saying he's had this divine revelation. I mean, is this guy just crazy or what? And there's never really been any, to me, satisfactory explanation of this. People simply write him off. He was just an odd guy or something like that. But what I want to try to argue today, or at least demonstrate through a kind of a narrative, is that Adler's revelation, in fact, corresponds to the rise of the left Hegelian movement in Denmark at the beginning of the 1840s. And this is the connection that for me was insightful. I hope you will find it insightful as well. Even though at first glance it doesn't look like there's any connection here at all. How on earth would this Danish left Hegelian movement have anything to do with Adler and his revelation? Well, let me try to convince you. Now, my reading time here will be, Anna told me 30 minutes, and I'm spent most of the day trimming it down to 30 minutes, but I can't promise I'm going to stop exactly on 30 minutes. So I beg your indulgence here. All right. Okay, let's look at the background here first. So that Hegel gave his lectures on the philosophy of religion in Berlin in the 1820s. And these lectures were then published by his follower, Philip Marheineke, in 1832, a year after Hegel's death. And these lectures were quite controversial, and they divided his students and his followers into two well-known groups, which to the history of philosophy, these are known as the right and the left Hegelians. What are these two groups? Well, the first group, the right Hegelians, they're like the conservative side. They're when you think left and right here, this really has not so much to do with politics, but more to do with religion. So the right Hegelians, they say Hegel's philosophy is consistent with Orthodox Christianity. And what Hegel's trying to do is to defend Orthodox Christianity. The left Hegelians, by contrast, they say, no, that's not true. What he's really doing, I mean, he's really sort of a behind-the-scenes free thinker who wants to criticize religion, and so Hegel's puts philosophy at the very highest point of his system, and religion is second. And so the point of Hegel is that we should go back and critically look at the elements of religion which have no real grounding, and sort of shed those away so we can get to the real truth of religion, which, according to Hegel, is a conceptual truth. Yeah, okay, that's just the short point of orientation. And so the left Hegelians in Prussia and the German states were at the center of controversy right from the beginning of the 1830s. One of Hegel's students, Ludwig Feuerbach, lost his position at the University of Erlangen in 1830 as a result of the publication of his Thoughts on Death and Immortality, where he denied the Christian doctrine of immortality of the soul. Another of Hegel's students, David Friedrich Strauss, suffered the same fate. He lost his position at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Tübingen for his work, The Life of Jesus, which was published in 1835 and 36. And in this work, he argued controversially that the stories in the Gospels were largely myths and couldn't really be taken as historical facts. And so, yeah, this, needless to say, was controversial stuff. Strauss also had another appointment rescinded in 1839 at the University of Zurich after there was a great public outcry, the announcement that the university wanted to hire this guy, and so they withdrew their offer. And so the matter took on a new urgency at the beginning of the 1840s, the period that's of interest to us, because of the publication of Feuerbach's The Essence of Christianity in 1841, and Strauss's the Christian Doctrine in 2 volumes, 1840 and 41. And there was at the time, there was a genuine fear that the views, these free-thinking views, these quasi-atheistic or agnostic views that were promulgated by the left Hegelians, that this is just going to undermine religious belief and morals and, yeah, indeed, the very fabric of society. So it's in reaction to this that the King of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, he perceives this as such a terrible, pernicious force that he appoints the famous philosopher Schelling to a professorship at the University of Berlin and says, Schelling, your job is to fight against these left Hegelians. Now, we all recall this is the time when Kierkegaard goes to Berlin in order to hear Schelling's lectures in 1841. So it's at the same time that there's this, persecution of the left Hegelians. So the Prussian government also banned all left Hegelians from teaching at Prussian universities, and they also banned all the political journals that had a tendency towards the left Hegelian movement. And so this was quite a serious matter, right, that the Prussian government really felt that they had to deal with in fairly strong terms. Now, how did this play out then in Scandinavia? In Sweden, there was a crisis that arose in July of 1841 with the publication of a Swedish translation of Strauss's Life of Jesus. And so the religious authorities, they ordered the book to be confiscated and brought a case against the publisher. Although ultimately he was acquitted, the confiscation order was rescinded in November of 1841. This case was really much spoken about, and also the Danish intellectual world knew about it as well. And this was in the back of their minds when the Danish Strauss controversy broke out, which came soon thereafter. And so the left Hegelian movement was beginning to gain strength in Denmark at this time, and also caused alarm. In 1836, some extracts from this Strauss's Life of Jesus appeared in a Danish translation in the Journal for Foreign Theological Literature. And so you might think, okay, this journal is open-minded. Let's publish some of these extracts from Strauss and see what people think. But no, they were basically setting them up, because they then subsequently published a whole string of critical reviews. They had also translated from the German literature, so trying to discredit Strauss's work. Also, November 37. Grundtvig also wrote an article called The Christian Church and German Theology, where he is extremely critical of Strauss. And so by the beginning of the 1840s, Strauss was already a fairly well-known figure to the Danish theologians and philosophers, and he was perceived to be a real danger to religious faith. And perhaps some of you will be familiar with Kierkegaard's friend and its relative, Hans Bruckner, who was at the center of a major scandal at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Copenhagen at the end of 1841. So Bruckner entered the University of Copenhagen at the age of 16, and after an initial study of philology, including Arabic and Hebrew, he decided to dedicate himself to theology. And in the course of his studies, he came under the influence of the left Hegelians, and especially Strauss. And the scandal arose when Bruckner submitted his petition to take his final examination in theology. So this was the examination that would complete his studies and would thereby qualify him for the priesthood in the Danish church. The Faculty of Theology was quite disturbed by his views and his apparent agreement with Strauss, and they refused to let him take the exam. It was customary that the candidates for the examination, they would submit along with their request for the exam, just a brief account about their studies and their intellectual development as a part of the application. And so in this short work in Latin, which was submitted on December 18th, 1841, Bruckner, he quite openly recounts while studying Hegel, how he came to give up central Christian doctrines such as the notion of personal God and the immortality of the soul. And so in a key passage here, he writes, I quote, I did not know at that point in time that I was of the same opinion as Strauss. I believed that he was similar to the atheists who in their time played a leading role in England, and I intentionally kept away from his works. But later, when my conviction had long since taken root and had been firmly grounded, I started on his works, from which I thankfully confess to having learned various things, with the exception of a few points which concern more the periphery of his system than its center. I am completely in agreement with him, end quote. So this open avowal of Strauss's views were simply too much for the Faculty of Theology to accept. And so the response from the faculty came in a letter dated December 24th from Professor Matthias Hulenberg. And in his letter, Hulenberg notes that some of Bruckner's statements, they inevitably gave the members of the faculty some reason for pause. And he points out that the examination qualifies the candidate to become a pastor in the Danish church, and then raises the question about the consistency of the assumption of such an office with the views expressed by Bruckner. And so he asked Bruckner to go ahead and explain his position, this time in Danish, forget the Latin, just explain what your position is vis-a-vis Strauss. And so in a way, that it's kind of a diplomatic approach that the faculty is taking there. They probably knew this wasn't just a linguistic confusion here, right? But they're giving Bruckner a chance to recant his heretical views with this gesture. And so Bruckner, fine, he responded to this. In his response, in his letter to the faculty, he explains his position. And however, Bruckner, he in effect incriminates himself by going on to give an account of his own personal views towards Christianity. And here, he more or less openly acknowledges that he doesn't subscribe to any of the key Christian dogmas. He agrees it would be dubious for someone with such views to enter the priesthood, but he notes this isn't what the qualifying examination is all about, and it doesn't automatically provide him with an appointment to the church. The real problem would come if Bruckner at some point in time were to obtain such a position and were bound to swear the customary oath of office, which obliged him to agree to the doctrines of the church. But he grants that kind of a situation would be problematic, but again, that's not the situation of the exam, and there's no reason that he shouldn't be able to take it. And further, he states he's not interested in pursuing a career in the church, but rather he wants to stay in the academic world, and there would be no problem at a scholarly vocation for him to fulfill his duties, regardless of what his religious convictions might be. And so the faculty immediately responds to Bruckner's response here to take the examination, and it based its decision on the fact that it's simply incommensurable with its office as the Faculty of Theology to allow students to take the exam who, by their own admission, have been led away from the Christian faith and who couldn't really in good conscience accept a position in the Danish state church. And so what were the results of this? So this is a kind of a big event in Danish academic life at the day. It was discussed with great agitation and great animation in the newspapers, the journals at the time. It caused a big public debate about the question of intellectual freedom and about the role of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Copenhagen vis-a-vis the Danish state church. So the immediate result for Bruckner was he had to choose another field of studies if he wanted to graduate. He ultimately did complete his studies some years later, 1845, with a major in Semitic philology with minors in Greek, Latin, and philosophy. He later went on to become a professor of philosophy. However, the examination scandal was to have far-reaching implications for the development of philosophy and theology in Denmark. It marked the rise to prominence of the Straussians and other followers of the left Hegelian movement. The rise of the left Hegelians caused really a great consternation among the conservative religious forces in Denmark. Right? We have to remember, of course, religion played a central role in Danish society at the time, and the Danish state church and the Faculty of Theology at the University of Copenhagen, they had really dominant positions in the cultural life of the day. And after the examination scholars, theologians were really quick to criticize both Hegel and the left Hegelians. And it's not difficult to imagine the atmosphere, the tension in the air when in 1842, right after all this was going on, the professor of theology, Carl Emil Scharling, he gave the introductory lecture to his course on apologetics at the Faculty of Theology. And this lecture was entitled "The Struggle Against Christianity in the Most Recent Time." And he later went on to publish this as an article in a theological journal there. In this work, he violently criticizes Strauss. And so after the examinations scandals, Scharling, he really felt the need to go out there and stamp out all the interest in Strauss's thought that still existed among the students of theology who were sympathetic with Bruckner. So the perceived danger of the rise of the left Hegelians put pressure on anyone who had previously been perceived as a Hegelian to distance themselves from Hegel in order to demonstrate that they were in fact pious Christians. And so the examination scandal triggered a series of works that tried to do just this. And so some of you will know the name Hans Martensen, who was a famous theologian and lecturer at the University of Copenhagen. He gave these extremely popular lectures, indeed the most popular at the university up until that time, in 1837, where he introduced Hegel's philosophy to the university. But now, in 1842, the times were changing with the rise of the left Hegelians, and the specter of free thinking appeared to be a real threat, which could be potentially damaging for him. So Martensen, he openly acknowledges that this new movement began in his own lecture hall. I'm quoting here from his memoirs that he wrote many decades later. He says, among some of the students there form what can be called a hostile opposition to my deviations from Hegel. Indeed, it soon appeared that also the Hegelian left gained ground among several of my auditors who opposed me from a pantheistic standpoint. That would be the left Hegelians, right? The spirits of philosophy had been set free, and it was a matter of whether one could quiet them. So even before the examination scandal breaks out, Martinson has seen this in his own classroom. How some of his own students are dissatisfied with his lectures because he's presenting a more orthodox form of Hegel's philosophy, and they're critical of him already then. But then also, even before the examination scandal in 1840, Martinson had been publicly attacked by an anonymous critic in the journal Kubenauens Posten. And then the title of this article is something like "Some Remarks on Some Aspects of a Characterization of the Philosophical Spirit, which at present is found among the students at the University of Copenhagen." And so the critic, he argues directly that Hegel's philosophy leads people away from faith, and that Martinson is doing great damage by teaching it to the impressionable young students at the university. And although Martinson defended himself against this criticism, this public episode was really problematic for him as a member of the Faculty of Theology. He was thus very pressed to distance himself from the left Hegelians in order to avoid being charged with preaching free thinking from the lectern. And so this is really a vexing thing for Martinson with the examinations. He had seen the example that the Faculty of Theology had set with Bruckner for his advocation of Strauss's thought. And Martinson presumably feared that, given his interest in Hegel, he would simply be associated with Hegel's student, Strauss, and his free-thinking views. And so all of these events they served as a motivation for Martinson to write an article to set things straight. And this is the article entitled "The Present Religious Crisis," which he uses in order to distance himself from left Hegelianism and to demonstrate his loyalty to the mission of the Danish state church. So it was in the third issue of Johann Ludwig Heiberg's new journal, the Intelligenzblätter, dated April 15th, 1842, where Martinson publishes his article. And although Hegel's name isn't mentioned explicitly, this is an important text, since it's usually thought to mark a change in Martinson's position, or at least a clarification of it. And he uses the word crisis in his title here intentionally, because here he's making an allusion to Heiberg's treatise from 1833, right, on the significance of philosophy for the present age, where Heiberg begins with this oral story about, the present age is in a state of crisis, right, and our culture and our religion, our philosophy are in a crisis, and so it's Hegel's philosophy which is going to save us. And basically, Heiberg's thesis in that work. So Martinson makes use of that idea of a cultural crisis. Like Heiberg, he's concerned that the church is losing its meaning, and that especially among educated people. And Martinson, in this work, he really wants to make a case for the continued relevance of the church, and that, like Heiberg, he believes that there's a certain erosion of faith in the present age that is quite worrying, and that where some sort of a solution needs to be found. But the article is framed by an analysis of two completely different trends. I mean, really opposite ends of the social political spectrum. The Anabaptists on the one side and the Straussians on the other. And so the Danish Anabaptists, they tended to be quite conservative. They claimed that they alone had the correct understanding of the Bible and Christianity. Then they were, in a sense, at war with the mundane, since they were critical of all forms of secular life. They thought that the Danish state church had drifted away from the original Christian truths, and as a state institution, it was corrupt and was in no way qualified really to be a representative for true Christianity. Um, the Straussians, on the other hand, I mean, they were more educated. Strauss uses the word the Danende, right, the Gebilden, if you will, to describe these people, that they believe that if there's anything at all about Christianity that needs to be rescued, then it's important to get to the bottom of the myths and the misrepresentations, and so that's what they want to do. So they're explicitly trying to undermine Christianity instead of try to find a way to defend it. And so Martinson's goal is to try to make a case for the Danish state church, which he regards as a rational middle ground between these two, it's like fanatical extremes. While he grants that modern philosophy, that is Hegel's philosophy, is given rise to this dangerous movements like that led by Strauss, nonetheless, it can still be used in the service of religion and the church. And so Martinson proposes a compromise by acknowledging that the state church contains both a religious and a secular element. And he's quick to distinguish Hegel's philosophy, which he regards as fruitful and productive, from that of Strauss. So that's really the key point here, where Martinson wants to say, sure, Strauss is a dangerous guy, but I'm not like him. I'm something else. Right? And so he writes in the article, I'm quoting here, the philosophical revival in our age. So he's talking here about Hegel's philosophy, right? This is Heiberg's big thing. It's a revival of philosophy, which we have with Hegel, and we need this to welcome this to Danish cultural life. So the philosophical revival in our age, from which many a false philosophy has developed among many people, stands directly or indirectly in connection with the strivings which the real philosophy has undertaken in order to reform the sciences and thus all culture. So Hegel's philosophy, as Heiberg has told us, is here to reform the sciences and our cultural life in Denmark. Sadly, right, it has led to many a false philosophy. So this is Strauss, this is Feuerbach, these are the left Hegelians that he wants to object to. And this has led, he claims, many religiously inclined people to reject what he's calling here the real philosophy, that is Hegel's philosophy. However, by doing so, he thinks that they miss the opportunity to make use of it in order to further the cause of religion as Hegel intended. So quoting again from the article, but it is an experience which was repeated almost everywhere, that many people who wanted to protect the interests of religion in the church, and who precisely because of this ought to have placed themselves in a living reciprocal relation with philosophy in order to make use of the means it offers for renewal and further development of religious knowledge, place themselves in a hostile relation to all speculation. So these are the conservative religious people which have criticized Heiberg, which has criticized Martin, and they want to reject Hegel's philosophy completely. They think that this is not going to help us. Martin says, no, this will really help with the reforms that are needed. So in short, we see the right Hegelian Martinson making a plea for a cooperation or a unity of philosophy and theology. Philosophy can enrich theology and religion by helping to clarify and ground its doctrines. And so this should start to ring some bells, right, from Kierkegaard's early journal, right, AA, where Kierkegaard makes this claim: philosophy and religion, they can never be united. That's exactly Martinson's thesis. Yes, of course they can be united, and they should be, because this is going to help religion. So ultimately, Martinson's article is a plea for the state church to effect the needed changes so that they can better address these problems expressed by the Anabaptists and the Straussians. And Martinson's conception of these reforms is still yeah, it's still Hegelian, specifically right Hegelian, since he wants philosophy and theology to work together to resolve the problem. The errors have arisen due to a radical split between faith and reason, and the church needs to bring the two together in order to resolve the crisis, so he thinks. And so we put this article into its context. We can see that with the experience of Bruckner fresh in mind, there is evidence that the mood in Denmark was soon to turn hostile to the left Hegelians, as it had proven hostile in Prussia and in the German states. With the examination scandal, a warning shot had been fired, and Martensen prudently heeded it. Martensen, who only a few years before, he'd been like the young Maverick at the Faculty of Theology. Now he finds himself only some years later on the other side. Now he belongs to these conservative forces who's opposed to the opinions of the young students, right, who are of course keen to follow the new movement now with Strauss and Feuerbach. And so we have here then Soren Kierkegaard's article, A Public Confession, which it refers to Martensen's article, published shortly thereafter. Kierkegaard also thematizes the religious sects in Denmark, makes explicit reference to both the Anabaptists and the Straussians. He's clearly talking about Martensen's article. While his tone is satirical, his point seems to be pretty much the same as that of Martensen, that there's widespread religious confusion that's given rise to different groups, and primarily due to Kierkegaard's work in which he makes use of Hegel, for example, from Papers of One Still Living, or his dissertation, The Concept of Irony, and of course with his association with Heidelberg. Kierkegaard found himself also associated with the Hegelians and with the Straussians. And that is, at the time now, it's become a real stigma. And so he responds, when he tries to respond with Public Confession by explicitly distancing himself from this. And he has in mind specifically a book by Andreas Friedrich Beck, namely The Concept of Myth or the Form of Religious Spirit, which had been published recently. Beck was a Straussian, makes use of Strauss's methodology. And in this book, he refers to Kierkegaard along with the Straussians. And this is what drives Kierkegaard crazy, right? And so he sort of satirically writes in the article, right? In the book, Herr Dr. Beck recently published, I see that he has most incredibly thrust me in among the Straussians. In formation with Strauss, Feuerbach, Vodka, Bruno Bauer, I must, whether I want to or not, keep step. And so he spends quite a lot of time making fun of Beck in his book. But the real message is a serious one, right? He doesn't want to be associated with Strauss and the left Hegelians either, right? He wants to make perfectly clear that there are people who are saying that there's this connection between me and these left Hegelians. Well, there's not. And so the fact that the examination scandal evoked these responses from people like Martensen and Kierkegaard really shows its importance, right? Both of these guys were very quick to come out with their own articles to say, no, I'm not like those guys, right? I'm not like Bruckner. I'm not a left Hegelian or a Straussian. And now we come to, oops, let me see here. There we go. We come to Adler's works on Hegel. So up until this point, Adler had been a committed Hegelian. He published a number of works in which Hegel played quite a significant role. First was his criticism of Heiberg's article on Hegelian logic from the second issue of Perseus. And then there was his dissertation, The Isolated Subjectivity in its Most Important Forms, also from 1840, which made very substantial use of several of Hegel's works. Most important was his popular lectures on Hegel's objective logic from 1842, which was a sort of commentary on the first two books of Hegel's Science of Logic. So Adler had made a reputation for himself as a leading proponent of primarily Hegel's logic. Having completed his degree, Adler received an appointment as a local pastor on the island of Bornholm in 1841. This new position put his works on Hegel in a completely new light. In the first part of 1843, now, in Adler's book, right, the popular lectures on Hegel's objective logic, was reviewed by the Danish pastor and theologian Hans Friedrich Helveg. This review of Adler's work contains many critical observations about the significance of Hegel's philosophy for a religion, although this, at first glance, that might seem a little bit irrelevant. What does that have to do with Hegel's logic that Adler's talking about? But Helveg, in fact, he's justified in this because Adler himself makes very active use of religious ideas and motifs, quotes the Bible quite a lot in his account of Hegelian logic. So you can see Adler, he's still a theologian at heart. And this is what irritates Helveg. Helveg concludes that it's with justice that Hegel's philosophy has been charged with abstraction. Hegel's logic amounts to a mere formalism of categories with no relation to life or actuality. Helveg thus criticizes Hegel for trying to understand God abstractly apart from the revelation in time. So for Helveg, this is just amounts to mysticism. And the point of Helveg's criticism is aimed not just at Hegel, but also at Adler, who's really at pains to show that Hegel's philosophy is in harmony with the teachings of Christianity. So put differently, Adler is defending a right Hegelian position, as was the case with Martinson. And so Helveg's main point with the review concerns precisely this relation of Hegel's philosophy to Christianity. For in Helveg's eyes, these two are completely incompatible. Helveg's in agreement with Kierkegaard on this point. Hegel's philosophy can't be brought into harmony with Christian doctrine. And he's clearly worried for the sake of Christianity, not just about the attacks from the left Hegelians, but even from the misunderstandings and confusions of the orthodox Hegelians, such as Adler. Now, although Helveg's review of Adler's book is generally kind of positive and wants to be encouraging, nonetheless, with this criticism about the incompatibility of Hegel's philosophy and Christianity, that the damage was really done. So Helveg's book review put Adler in really an awkward and vulnerable situation. How could he be an advocate of a philosophy that was antithetical to Christianity and at the same time serve as a Lutheran pastor? So as we all know, right, this is precisely the same contradiction that Kierkegaard explores in the book on Adler. How do these things fit together? Well, what's Adler thinking? How can he not see this contradiction? So now with the rise of the left Hegelians and the danger of being associated with them, Adler, like the spokesman for Hegel, in effect found himself in the same situation as Martinson. Just as Martinson presumably feared losing his position at the University of Copenhagen due to the charges that he was some radical who led the students away from Christianity. So also now Adler, he must have feared for his position as a representative of the Danish state church. And so like Martinson, he realized he needed a way to distance himself from Hegelians, from the left Hegelians, from Hegelianism in general, lest his own position at the church become precarious. Instead of writing an article criticizing the Straussians as Martinson and Kierkegaard did, Adler arrived at a more radical solution. As we know, right, he claimed to have experienced a divine revelation in December of 1842. He gives an account of this in the preface to his collection, Some Sermons, which is dated June 18th, 1843. That is not long after Helveg's review. According to Adler's portrayal, Christ appeared to him in person one night, dictated to him the story of the origin of evil in the world. And this is what Adler describes in this preface. I quote just a bit of it here. In December of last year, I had almost completed work that I had wanted to call Popular Lectures on Subjective Logic. It was my own thought that had become immersed in itself and with a superficial knowledge of the Bible, had undertaken to explain creation and Christianity. One evening, I had just given an account of the origin of evil. Then I perceived, as if in a flash, that everything depended not upon thought, but upon spirit, and that there existed an evil spirit. And so, yeah, let's look at this for a second. So Adler's book, The Popular Lectures on Hegel's Objective Logic, and that we just talked about before, it covered only the first two books of Hegel's Science of Logic. And Helvig, in his review, encouraged him to go ahead and produce a sequel. And so this is what Adler portrays himself as working on when his revelation took place. So the new book is going to be called Popular Lectures on the Subjective Logic, not the objective. Right? And so the subjective logic is the third and final part of Hegel's Science of Logic. And now, in the preface, things get a little bit bizarre. When Adler writes, quote, that the same night a hideous sound descended into a room. Then the Savior commanded me to get up and go down and write these words. And then he goes ahead and quotes the text that he transcribed from Christ's speech. And if this isn't outrageous enough, Adler goes on to claim that Christ told him to destroy his previous works. Quote, then Jesus commanded me to burn my own works and in the future keep to the Bible. So, and what are his own works? Well, these are the works on Hegel's philosophy that we were just talking about. So instead of simply denying that he's a left Hegelian as Martinson did, Adler wants to leave no doubt about the matter by claiming that he is following a divine command to desist from all further study of Hegel. This represents a break far more radical than Martinson could ever have imagined. Adler leaves no doubt in the mind of the readers that he now believes that Hegel's philosophy is unchristian. I mean, who could doubt it? Right? Christ said so himself. Right? I mean, you can't ask for a stronger appeal to authority than that. And so with this preface, Adler, in a sense, he confesses the errors of his ways and repents. This can be seen as a response to Helvig's criticism, which charged Adler with being a follower of Hegel whose thought can't be accepted as Christian. And so here, you can see it's not just the question of I had a revelation, right? I saw Jesus in person, but it's the content of the revelation which is key. It's about Hegel's philosophy. This is an unchristian thing that you're doing, and so you have to destroy these works if you want to be a true Christian. And so in this sense, it's deeply connected to the rise of the left Hegelian movement in Denmark at the time. What Adler is doing is, and his means are different, but his motivation for doing this is very much the same as that of Martinson and Kierkegaard, by saying, okay, don't associate me with these guys. So needless to say, Adler's revelation didn't go down well with the Danish church. Bishop Munster, who had previously been positively disposed towards him, found himself in the first instance obliged to suspend him temporarily while the matter was investigated. Adler was officially called upon to answer a series of specific questions about his purported revelation that Munster put to him. Adler refused to retract his claims about the revelation and was ultimately dismissed from his post in 1845. He rather self-righteously published a pamphlet containing all the materials and official documents that led to his dismissal in order to show the injustice that he felt like he had suffered. There's a sad irony about Adler's fate here. He initially feared that his Hegelianism would raise questions about his orthodoxy and would cause problems for him with the church. I mean, that was what motivated him. But then he came up with the idea of having Christ command him via a revelation to abandon Hegel. But this remedy proved to be far more dangerous than the original disease. Use that metaphor. That given Münster's comments on the matter, it's doubtful that Adler's Hegelianism would ever have cost him his job. But claims to having experienced a revelation and seeing Christ in person, now that was a much more serious matter that was impossible for Münster, by virtue of his office, to ignore. So Adler's purported revelation marked the definitive end, not just to his career as a rural pastor, but also his contributions to the Danish Hegel reception. Although he continued to publish some works here and there on different topics, whatever influence or credibility he once had was now gone. In 1853, he returned from Bornholm to Copenhagen, where he lived the rest of his life in pretty much complete obscurity. In the book on Adler, Kierkegaard follows Helwig's lead and focuses on the contradiction between Adler's Hegelianism and Christian faith. The examination scandal, in a sense, created the terms and the framework for subsequent philosophical discussion in Denmark in the 1840s. So, scared off by the examination scandal, Martensen refrained from publishing anything substantial after his article, The Present Religious Crisis, in 1842. After 7 years of silence in 1849, he felt that his position was now sufficiently secure and that he could present to the reading public something new. And so when his book, The Christian Dogmatics, appeared in the summer of 1849, he must have regarded this as his magnum opus and presumably expected many words of praise. His expectations were disappointed, and with this work, he set off what is known to Danish intellectual history as a debate about faith and knowledge, which went on for about 2 years. This is a bitter debate because Martensen found that old friends and students had turned against him. For example, his colleague Rasmus Nielsen and his student Peter Michael Stilling completely abandoned him and went over to Kierkegaard's camp. So this discussion dominated the years 1849 and 50. What's interesting about the faith and knowledge debate is that the framework of the terms of it are determined by Hegel's philosophy. So on the one side of the debate, you have right Hegelianism represented by Martensen and his new work, Christian Dogmatics. Then on another side, you have the left Hegelians who, as we've been discussing, were regarded as free thinkers and defenders of the sciences. The best known of these figures are Bruckner himself and Andreas Friedrich Beck, whom I mentioned before. And the third group here was led by Kierkegaard and those who sympathized with him, such as Rasmus Nielsen, Peter Michael Stilling, and maybe we could add Magnus Eriksson in this group as well. And that all of these guys had become vocal critics of Martensen and his new book. But all three of these parties to the debate had something to do with Hegel. The first two were directly derived from Hegel, while the third was in part created and developed in critical dialogue with him. And so these are quite dynamic times, and many of Martensen's earlier students had in the interim become radicals following the left Hegelians or Kierkegaard. These shifts of position meant that Martensen found himself entirely alone, having to face a storm of criticism from both sides that he hadn't really expected. And so this framework here, the result of this examination scandal, which goes hand in hand with the rise of the left Hegelians, this explains a lot of things that I hadn't quite understood to my satisfaction before. I mean, this provides a new perspective on this period of the 1840s when Kierkegaard wrote his famous pseudonymous works, right? So first, this explains why Martensen wrote his article, The Present Religious Crisis, and why he felt this need to explicitly distance himself from Strauss and the left Hegelians and make a case that to be a right Hegelian, that would be a good pillar of support for the Danish church. Second, this explains why Kierkegaard wrote his satirical article, Public Confession. He also had to distance himself from Strauss and the left Hegelians against claims of, for example, of Beck, who wanted to associate Kierkegaard with the left Hegelians, since he was attentive to these Hegelian elements in the concept of irony, for example. Yeah, and so then third, I think, this provides a new perspective on the nature of Adler's purported revelation. As a pastor in the Danish state church, Adler, too, he had to distance himself from the left Hegelians. His motivation was the same as that of Martensen and Kierkegaard. In a sense, there's nothing really crazy about Adler's goal here. However, the means that he chose to achieve it was what was odd. One might still wish to insist on the original assessment. Okay, well, Adler is just a mentally unstable guy, but I claim here that there is a certain logos in this madness when you see his actions in this broader context of the times, in step with the rise of the left Hegelian movement and the examination scandal. Yeah, so I say thank you very much for your attention. I hope I haven't gone on for all too long here. So sorry about that if I have. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. I think we can turn right to questions, and I'm noting the hour and asking that anybody who can stay 10 minutes extra to 40 after, we can do that, and others have to go, we understand. Would you please use this raise hand symbol and I can call on people with questions. Please, Trey.
Hello, thank you very much, Dr. Stewart, for this. This is really helpful. I'm actually in the process of writing my PhD dissertation on the book on Adler, so this is extremely helpful context. My question is, so the Bruckner's examination scandal, you said dated from December of 1841, so there's a part in the book on Adler where Miner is talking about Adler's exegetical studies. He says this can be regarded as a reminiscence of Adler's exegetical studies, because this is the way Paul's conversion, for example, is exegeted. Something happened. What it is, one cannot say. It was an event, etc. So I found it interesting that the theology department reacted so. Was it a unanimous reaction against Bruckner's progression? Was it a strong reaction? Because what he seems to indicate here is that before 1841, already in the University of Copenhagen, they were teaching what Paul says that something happened to him on the Damascus Road. It obviously can't be that. What it is, we have no idea. So maybe that's not Hegelianism, but it is not a strict sort of orthodoxy. So I was kind of surprised when I heard that the theology department denied Bruckner's exam. What can you say about that?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Trey. I think, I don't have a good explanation for the allusion that you read from the book on Adler. I should go back and think about that a bit more. But yeah, it was a pretty serious thing. I mean, the Faculty of Theology, I mean, since they had conceived of their mission as being to train coming pastors for the Danish state church, if you have somebody coming up and saying, oh, I'm a Straussian, I don't believe in any of the dogmas, the Gospels are just a bunch of myths, That seems really entirely antithetical to what they're doing at the faculty, and so that's why I mean, they responded to him almost right away. One can only presume there was complete unanimity among the people at the faculty, and when yeah, Bruckner himself tries to make an appeal about this. He tries to go to the board of the University of Copenhagen and say, what they're doing, is this really even legal? Can they tell me I can't defend, I can't take the examination to complete my studies? Can they do this? And so the board of directors of the university, they agree with of course they did, right? They agree with the faculty. Yes, the faculty has done the right thing. You have no place in the faculty of theology whatsoever. And so they were also likewise quite scandalized by this. And so although, I mean, it is true that Denmark has always prided itself on the Rumlige Kirke, right? So it's the church which is wide enough it can encompass different groups. We can argue, right? We can have our differences of opinion. It's all okay. But this is something different, right? This isn't just a different religious sect. This is a group which is really denying the truth of Christianity, saying that, you know, the stories about Jesus in the Gospels are myths. I mean, that's a much more radical kind of a claim than doctrinal or sectarian things that you see within the church by people like Grundtvig or Klaus or whatever. I mean, they both were still thought that they were Christians, right? Even though they disagreed about that. Whereas Strauss and Bruckner, that's not the case. And so it's hard to go on like that.
Thanks so much. Ogbonna?
All right, thank you. Thanks for this provocative lecture. My question is somehow personal. That is, what motivated you to choose this topic? Because the problems you talked about with Christianity and the people who claim to be Christians teaching some other thing is also found in society now. And even some of the people who teach the Christian doctrine do not really believe. How can we solve this problem? Thank you.
Right. Yeah, this is, yeah, thanks so much for the question. Requires some thought. Actually, my motivation for this talk was just explained at the beginning, just the fact that suddenly when I read about the importance of these left Hegelians in Denmark at the time, suddenly some things started to click, certain things that I didn't quite, I knew about them, but I didn't know about them in this context, such as Adler's revelation. Then suddenly things started to make sense. And so I think that the whole story with the examination scandal, it really has a lot of explanatory power with regard to if you're interested in understanding Kierkegaard's writings in the context of the Golden Age. And I also was less aware of the nature of this faith and knowledge debate, where you have all of these people wanting to join Kierkegaard's camp. I mean, I guess might have heard of his friendship, his off and on friendship with Rasmus Nielsen, some of these other guys. Well, what's that all about, right? Whether you put it in this context, it makes sense. I mean, they're united by their opposition to Martin. So anyway, that's all. That was to my motivation, just because I found it quite insightful. Yeah, but to your question about the preaching of the Christian doctrine by people who don't necessarily really believe it, I guess this was this is a problematic issue, which does arise actually in Denmark from time to time, as I recall. And so there has to be some, I guess at this time in the 1840s, the line was much clearer. Than you couldn't simply go around saying these things explicitly. Okay, I don't believe in the Christian doctrine or whatever. I deny one dogma or the other. whereas in the modern Danish church, I mean, there were cases of this. Remember, this guy was one of the pastors in North Zealand, right? Who I mean, he was a pastor and had his own church and stuff, and just said he didn't believe in God. Well, okay, I mean, if it's a strange situation, but I mean, nothing really. His congregation supported him. He had some talks with the bishop or whatever, but it was okay. I mean, so that idea of like the roomly, the spacious church, I mean, it really stretches it beyond, yeah, what seems reasonable. Whereas, of course, they were in the 1840s far more sensitive to any sort of a deviation from dogma.
Thank you. Donnell?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I have also been wrestling with some questions that I have about Hegel and Kierkegaard, primarily thinking about how Kierkegaard wants to break away from Martinson and the right Hegelians because they're so quick to wanting to subsume faith into, or individual faith into, like universal concepts, right? And so I'm working on an article right now on Christian nationalism, and I'm thinking about how Christian nationalism kind of plays somewhat into this right Hegelian, if you will, wheelhouse. So could you help me to just think through, in response to the work that you're doing, how does the subsuming of individual faith in a collective religious identity like Christian nationalism, how does it contribute to Christian nationalism, right? So where religious conviction is used to kind of enforce a national or political agenda over personal or spiritual diversity. I'm just thinking about how would Kierkegaard respond to some of the problems we see today. Granted, it's different than Christendom in 19th century Denmark, but I wonder, how do we make Kierkegaard relevant given the right Hegelian stance and also given the direction of Christian nationalism? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Donnell. You have a beautiful baby. Yeah, the question of Christian nationalism, this is really a valuable one, because here you see the Danish state church, right? That's a national church, and you have Martinson, who is a representative of it, or Adler as well, a representative of it, and so there's a clear pressure there to agree on the doctrines that the national church has established, along with its basic practices and the way it's implementing that. And so there does seem to be that objective structure that Kierkegaard is always objecting to. Remember the stuff about the objective knowing and the subjective, and so there seems to be a tendency with the right Hegelians to that objective account of Christian faith. I mean, that's what Martinson is doing in his book, right? I mean, here are the Christian dogmas that we're supposed to believe in, and we can give these a rational understanding and explanation. We can understand these in terms of concept. It's a positive thing, but for Kierkegaard, no, that's not what faith is. That's what knowledge is about. That's what maybe science is about, but that's certainly not what Christian faith is about. And I think that's why Kierkegaard's argument that it really had found such a resonance among so many people in Denmark, because of the idea of an inwardness, an individual faith that he was promoting, that really seemed to strike a chord with people who somehow felt a certain degree of alienation with the larger Christian community in the national church. Yeah, and so I think you're right that there's a family resemblance there, that it makes sense that those guys the right Hegelians, who also want to be defenders of the church, in that organized form. This is a complex question. I guess for the left Hegelians, they're not interested in those issues at all. I mean, they want to criticize both the church and the dogmas, so they have no apologetic interest whatsoever. And in fact, this is why Kierkegaard pretty much leaves them alone. I mean, he has a few satirical things to say now and again about Feuerbach or about Strauss, but he's far less interested in them, far less critical of them than he is of the right Hegelians. Because for the right Hegelians, it's always about something, positive knowledge that you can demonstrate with philosophy or with history or something, and that's what he rejects. That's contrary to his idea of belief. Whereas the left Hegelians, I mean, if they say, okay, I deny that these are facts that are written in the gospel, I deny that this is historically true. Okay, I mean, it's your decision. If you want to take that position, that's fine. I have no objection to it. But what really bothers him is the idea of somebody presenting themselves as a Christian pastor and then making a claim that that what Christian faith is all about are these objective doctrines that one can argue for in a rational way. And so that, those are two completely different conceptions of faith. And I think Kierkegaard his position is quite sympathetic to people today as well, who want to put the focus much more on the individual and less so on larger institutions where we invariably feel ourselves a bit alienated from at times. Yeah, so thanks for the thoughtful question. Yeah, good luck with your project.
Thank you.
Thank you. And let's squeeze in one last question in response, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for the preview for your next work.
Thanks.
John, you know what? You answered part of my question almost just when you were talking to Donnell right now, because I guess my question is really about your intuition about where Kierkegaard is to these three basic positions, that is the right Hegelians, left Hegelians, and then the Kierkegaardians, because one of the things we see is that he really doesn't want to be associated with any of them, including the Kierkegaardians, right?
That's true.
So he tries to distance himself. He just somehow, he doesn't want to be a part of anything like a movement or anything that takes away that nuance. That's just not his way. But and you mentioned this again, and I think affirmed a kind of a memory I have about Kierkegaard's relation to the left Hegelians. I think, I mean, he's pretty silent about this, and what he writes when he does write about it is, well, you kind of know where you've got him. So, he doesn't go out of his way to really distance himself he's not provoked by them like he is right Hegelianism. That's just, it's clear that right Hegelian is something he really, really feels strongly about, and did far before the debate breaks out, even when he's up in Galilee, sort of looking out at the ocean, right? He's Christianity, philosophy, they shouldn't be merged. Just don't try to defend that stuff. Don't defend religion. But here's the funny thing, John, and getting to Adler, it's just sort of a question about Kierkegaard's relationship to Adler, because he writes this big book, a lot of reflection about this, because maybe he does recognize that his position isn't exactly Adler's position, but there's something about it that makes him think, what is it exactly? So this is my question. Do you see him sort of jumping into this question because he recognizes that there's something about this that is close to, if not my own position, at least I could see how there are family resemblances between what I'm trying to sort of always sort of indirectly talk about, and what Adler's not indirectly talking about. So there's something about just working that out, perhaps for himself, but perhaps also for an audience. But I'm just kind of curious, your intuitions about Kierkegaard's motivation for Adler and position here.
Yeah, I think he was particularly interested in Adler because he brings out the kind of a contradiction that somebody like Martinson does. I mean, how can you claim to be a Hegelian and at the same time to be a Christian? Because I mean, you could be the one or the other, but the two don't go together, according to Kierkegaard, because he has this conception of faith, which is antithetical to Hegel's rational system. And so, yeah, I think that's what I mean, we know all of his criticisms of Martinson about this point. He thinks Martinson is dishonest. He thinks he's a hypocrite, right? No, all of these things, that he's misrepresenting Christianity. And with Adler, I think it's a bit of the same, right? Up until the big revelation, as Kierkegaard discusses this, right? So prior to this, doesn't it ever dawn on Adler that, well, wait, I'm a Hegelian philosopher here. I am training, to be a pastor in the Danish church. Is there no contradiction here? I mean, what's he thinking in his own mind? What's his own conception of Christian faith? And so the Kierkegaard, he beats on this drum quite a bit on the book on Adler. And so in a certain sense, that's really a part of his attempt to formulate a conception of Christian faith, which is different from anything objective. And he thinks that Adler is completely confused in his mind, that he doesn't see this quite obvious contradiction. It's the thing about the revelation. Kierkegaard, he really he tries to understand this as a part of Adler's confusion about Christianity. That let's assume that this is true. So let's assume that he had a revelation. Look at the way he acted after that. I mean, what do? You go publish a book about it, right? You try to become famous about it or whatever. That's not really in harmony with what would happen if you really did have a revelation. Presumably you would have been moved in many different ways, but I mean, to go public with it in that way, Kierkegaard finds completely antithetical to it. But what I wonder about is if Kierkegaard also sees this point about what the gesture means with regard to Adler's Hegelianism, because you could read it that way, that, well, here's Adler's way of saying, I'm no longer a Hegelian. I have seen the contradiction. I've seen the problem. And so in that sense, you would think Kierkegaard would be more positive to his view after the revelation, but he's not, because he's irritated by the way Adler continues to act. And so then in this sense, you're right there, he wants to reject people who are even quite sympathetic to him in his position. I remember this long story with his friendship with Rasmus Nielsen. Right, so Nielsen goes out and publishes a book very much inspired by Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard just furious with him. Right, you have completely missed the point. Right, you completely misrepresented. Don't do that again. Right. 6 months later, Nielsen does exactly the same thing, exactly the same feud. What are you doing? I told you not to. Right. Again and again. It's happened like 5 times. It's amazing they remained friends after that. It's amazing that Nielsen never got it, really.
Yeah. Well, thanks, John. Thanks. Yeah, we can probably continue this. Yeah. Thanks, John.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can all imagine what Kierkegaard would think of all of us writing books as Kierkegaardians, how happy he would be with our projects. John, I'm grateful to you. I think so much light has been shed on the conversation, the things that were going on at the time, that I think is really helpful. And I think I can say that we all look forward very much to the extended version of all of this with your latest book. And thank you to everyone for your participation. It's been a really great session. And please join me in thanking Jon again. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Uh,
Bye-bye.